Diabolical though they often were, trench systems came into existence for good, practical, and tactical reasons. The idea of all field works was to protect and hide troops. The particular conditions which emerged during the latter part of 1914 made trenches a necessity rather than an option. Killing power had developed exponentially. In 1814, a soldier in battle would have been lucky to achieve 3 musket shots per minute to an effective range of about 100 meters. In 1914, the bolt-action rifle made 10 aimed rounds per minute at 500 meters perfectly practical. In 1814, field guns could not usually be fired more than once a minute, generally used solid shot, and few were of much effect beyond 1,000 meters. By 1914, quick-fire breech-loading field guns were routinely throwing air-bursting shrapnel rounds more than 10 times a minute out to more than 5,000 meters. At the same time, the number of men and weapons had vastly increased. The German army had seen the greatest expansion, being 10 times the size of the Prussian army of the Napoleonic period. But all armies had grown several-fold. By 1914, rapid movements were channeled by timetables and rail tracks, while telegraphs, telephones, and balloons gave warning of a foe's approach. Moreover, on the Western Front, the forces of the Entente and Central Powers were too finely balanced to allow for immediate victory. The alternatives in late 1914 were stark: dig in and accept heavy casualties, or stay on the surface indefinitely and be annihilated. As one Canadian wrote, they had to hide in the mud of the trenches to escape German bullets. It was a choice of mud or death. The principal aim of field fortification is to enable the soldier to use his weapon with the greatest effect. The second, to protect him from enemy fire, thus reducing losses and increasing the power of resistance in any part of the battlefield. More troops would be available to swell the force destined for decisive action there or elsewhere. The conundrum of the Great War was that there were so many men with such effective weapons so evenly balanced that there was no elsewhere. The war was only ever static in a geographic sense. There was a constant tactical, technological, and industrial evolution, whereby the trench deadlock would eventually be broken. The war would develop so quickly that a man wounded in 1914 and returning to the front in 1916 would have had some difficulty understanding that it was the same war. The infantry were universally supplied with entrenching tools to provide their own cover. Improvised cover could be dug fairly quickly and give temporary protection for a prone rifleman, a hole 12 inches deep. It was estimated that a good job could be made within the hour. British troops were taught to work lying down and to commence at the rear of the selected position. Hard soil is more easily broken up by this method, and a hollow for the disengaged arm is gradually provided, which helps keep the digger under cover. Kneeling cover could be made by linking individual scrapes together, but was better done on pre-planned lines, using reliefs of troops in a systematic manner. According to the manual, a 3-foot fire trench of adequate dimension to cover its diggers could be created in 100 minutes. A standing fire trench would require upwards of 5 hours and was likely to require 2 shifts. Sandbags and barbed wire were in very limited supply in 1914, and brushwood, sacks, sod, and timber revetments were all used. French manuals placed particular emphasis on making fascines and gabions from natural materials. Yet their trenches soon acquired a reputation for slovenliness and poor construction. Bodies were actually buried in the floor of the trenches, thereby making them shallower as the casualties mounted. The French attitude to the trench building was in part born of an unwillingness to admit a permanent enemy presence on their homeland and the desire to go on the offensive. With the onset of winter, the deadlock became total. Continuous trench lines now extended from the Belgian coast to the Swiss frontier. The Germans had not yet constructed the formidable defensive systems which, for most of the war, their overall strategy in the West would dictate. Believing in late 1914 that the building of a second position might weaken the resolve of the troops in the front defenses, the Germans depended at first on a single line. This line was to be held at all costs. However, during the winter, they revised this policy, adding depth to these defenses with concrete machine gun posts 1,000 yards to the rear of the front line. Having prepared for siege operations at the outset of the war, the Germans were comparatively well endowed with weapons suitable for trench warfare, including mortars, grenades, heavy guns, and howitzers. The BEF, however, was compelled to fashion improvised mortars from drain pipes and grenades from jam tins. All the armies were experiencing shell shortages. Falkenhayn later stated that the failure of just one ammunition train that winter threatened to render whole sections of the front defenseless. The French, requiring 50,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition daily, were producing only 11,000 rounds per day in mid-November 1914, while by January, some British 18-pounder guns were restricted to firing just 4 rounds a day. Casualty rates in 1914 hit the BEF particularly hard. As a small professional volunteer force, it could ill afford the loss of 3,627 officers and 86,237 men between August and December 1914. In Britain, Kitchener, who foresaw a long and costly war, had begun a vast expansion of Britain's military forces. He formed a series of new armies, each of which duplicated the 6 divisions of the original BEF. More than 1,186,000 volunteers enlisted in the first 5 months, but they would take time to train. Meanwhile, the British soldiers at the front were struggling to hold the line. Musketry standards had already declined and morale had slumped as the Germans made gains in minor operations at Givenchy in December. Christmas 1914 was marked by a spontaneous unofficial truce in Flanders, where German and British soldiers fraternized in no man's land, taking photographs, swapping souvenirs, and even playing football. On Christmas Eve, the soldiers in the field agreed not to fire on one another. That night, on a front where 5 days earlier there had been savage fighting, the guns fell silent. On the following morning, German soldiers walked across towards the British wire, and British soldiers went out to meet them. The soldiers appeared with souvenirs, capstars, and badges. The British gave the Germans plum pudding. The Germans invited their enemy into their trenches and serenaded them with Christmas songs. When the Germans began to bury some of their frozen dead, the British soldiers had another shock.
They would put, the Germans, for Vaterland und Freiheit, for fatherland and freedom. And I said to a German, "Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom." And he said, "Excuse me, English comrade, camarade, but we are fighting for freedom, for our country." And I say, you also put, "Here rests in God an unbekannter, held. Here rests in God an unknown hero, in God." Oh yes, God is on our side, but I said he's on our side. Well, English comrade, do not let us quarrel on Christmas Day.
The day after Christmas, infantrymen of both sides shouted warnings to their opposite number before opening fire. Hardening attitudes, as the war became increasingly bloody and impersonal, ensured that such incidents on this scale would not recur, but live and let live understandings accepted by both sides frequently prevailed in quiet sectors until the end of the war. Falkenhayn's decision in November 1914 to stand temporarily on the defensive in the West proved to be a huge mistake. A weakened and now inexperienced BEF might not have withstood further heavy blows during the winter. The respite granted by the Germans allowed the Allies to reorganize, giving Britain in particular the chance to train Kitchener's new armies and strengthen the BEF with additional territorial and Dominion contingents. Falkenhayn hoped that once the Russians had been pushed back over the Vistula, he would resume the offensive in the West. However, a combination of factors forced him to continue with a predominantly defensive operation, at least for the first part of the new year. The stage was set for the conquest of the hell called No Man's Land.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. Oh, wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilian sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as Rebellion is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Oh, boys, right, son, how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, won't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Fast, retard, we spend the money we earn. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.